Here we go. Episode 21 of Red versus Blue. My name is Mike Stark.
And I'm Keith Curry.
And, you never have a slow week in politics, really. But this week has been a little slower than other weeks. So we thought we'd talk a little bit about a subject we touched on over the course of this podcast. And that is the situation in Israel and Gaza. I watched a show this past week that brought some questions to mind over how Israel is handling this conflict. First of all, I got to go to Keith because he really can sum up what's going on over there. So if you can, in a nutshell, tell us what's happening there.
This might be a little longer than our typical show with that kind of question, but here we go. So Israel was formed in 1948. There was an immediate war by their neighbors to try and kick them off. They won. There was a war in 1957, promulgated mostly by the British and the French to keep control of the Suez Canal. America did not back that war, and basically they backed off of that. There was another war in 1967 where Israel took control of the West Bank, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula, and Gaza. There was another war in 1973, which Israel again prevailed. There was two intifada's, as they are called, which were basically uprisings by Palestinians between 1987 to 1993, and then again 2000 to 2005. So there's been nearly a constant set of conflict here each decade, really since the founding of Israel. What we have here, Israel pulled out of there following the Gaza Accords. It's self-governing by Hamas. Hamas was elected by the people of Gaza. No election since then. And they have been planning for years and have 300 miles of underground tunnels to hold missiles, etc. An attack on Israel, which they perpetrated on October 7th, killing several thousand Israelis and kidnapping many more. And Israel retaliated. Now, they retaliated in Gaza, which is a small area with roughly 1.5 million people in it, and found that the Hamas enemy was embedded deeply within the civilian population. They'd built their tunnels and command centers under hospitals, UN centers, schools, mosques, etc. And that made it a very difficult war to prosecute without civilian casualties. And there have unfortunately been many. Israel has now pushed them down to the small village of Rafah, which is up against the Egyptian border. There's maybe 1.5 million people there, 1.2 million people there. And the question is, what do they need to do to complete the war? And how do you complete the war? And that's where we are today.
That's a beautiful summation, and it didn't take too long, but I think it actually did sum up where we are at this point. Now, as I said, I watched a piece last week, and I've been pro-Israel, and I still am. I think they're our greatest ally of all. But I did have some questions about a couple things. First of all, it's obvious that there's a lot of civilians being killed in this, and that is the work of Hamas, who have built their strategy around hiding amongst the civilians. Am I correct so far?
That's absolutely correct.
Okay, so it's a tough war to prosecute because of that, but there's still an awful lot of civilian casualties involved in this, and a lot of children, and it's just ugly no matter how you cut it. Now, the other part that scares me is the fact that there's very little Western press allowed in the area, and that is the work of Israel, who have basically banned Western journalists from being in Gaza. And there's safety issues. I understand that. There's been a bunch of reporters already killed there. And of course, there were aid workers a week or so ago that were also killed in Gaza. So it's a dangerous place. But I just have a problem with not having a transparency of some sort of press, because there's always going to be somebody that wants to cover it. That's what the press does. So how do you address those issues, Keith?
Well, first of all, let's recognize you still get 20 minutes of reporting out of Gaza on CNN and the other networks every night, particularly when something's going on. It is dangerous for the reporters. And while Israel has been pretty successful at pushing back Hamas and at killing roughly 13,000 is the estimate currently of the Hamas fighters, there is no doubt that Hamas has won the public relations war. They have used the media through Al Jazeera, but also Western media, and manipulated it the whole discussion about the missile at the hospital, which went on for a week. Well, that was a Hamas missile that fell on the hospital after they fired it towards Tel Aviv.
Right.
Those kinds of misinformation things have been the most successful elements in Hamas generating world opinion and isolating Israel on the world stage. That's not to say that Israel has not made mistakes. The world food bombing was a mistake. They acknowledged the mistake. They replaced the officers who ordered it. One can question the wisdom of having a motorcade pull through a war zone in the middle of the night. But nonetheless, it was a mistake which they acknowledged. Israel does acknowledge its mistakes and does acknowledge when civilian casualties occur, unlike Hamas, who just kills people randomly.
Right.
But nonetheless, they've been losing the PR battle. Should we have more open journalism? Yes. But every time a journalist gets killed, that becomes the dominating story. And Joe Biden comes out and tries to tell them you must fight the war, but you can't shoot at journalists, even though journalists are standing in the line of fire, and tries to micromanage how they go about this. And that's just not a successful strategy.
Well, having known a lot of journalists in my life, because I work in that sort of business, I know that those folks, for the most part, they want to get the story. The danger doesn't affect them. They want to have the transparency of being able to report from a war zone. It's not for me, not for a lot of journalists, but there are people that want to go in there and report what's going on. And I just feel a little concerned that they're being stifled a little bit in that. I would think that the more reporting that comes out of there, the less propaganda that the Hamas could bring, because then there'd be more Western journalists over there who would actually see what's going on and report on it.
More transparency and more information that's accurate information is always a good thing. Getting it in a war zone where people are being killed, where there's guerrilla warfare going on, where there's urban warfare going on, where there's 200 miles of tunnel that are yet to be deactivated is a challenge. People tell Israel, don't kill third parties, don't kill relief workers, don't kill journalists, but then they want to flood the zone with journalists and relief workers. And so those two things are not always compatible.
Right. And I think we can't lose touch with the fact that Hamas has used their civilian population as fodder in this. And I think that is the real problem here.
It is a type of warfare that is just utterly unconscionable. And the unfortunate part is a lot of journalistic stories today begin with yes, Hamas is using them as human shields, but let's look at how many people got killed by the Israelis today who are innocent bystanders. And that becomes a storyline, which is why Hamas has been winning public relations war so far.
The one thing we have to also remember is, as you pointed out in your opening and talking about the history of this, it's a very, very complicated 3D chess game ever since the end of World War II, right?
Right. And you could even go back before that. Actually, in World War I is when the British took over what's now called Palestine. Before that, it had been for 500 years part of the Ottoman Empire. Before that, it was part of the Mamluk Empire from Egypt. Before that, it was part of the Byzantine Empire from Constantinople when it used to be the Christian center. Before that, it was Roman. Before that, it was the Kingdom of Israel. So you can go back many, many years. There has never actually been a Palestinian state. If you Google Palestinian state, what comes up is in 1988, 40 years after the founding of Israel, a group of people got together and said, we are the Palestinian Authority, but they never had any geographic integrity. They never had a national capital. They never had nationhood as we would otherwise define it. Nonetheless, they are indigenous people there. Now, they're indigenous people because they're born there. I was born in California, so if that makes me an indigenous person, somebody owes me an Indian casino license. So when people say that the Israelis are occupying their land, well, it's not their land. It was British protectorate. It was Ottoman Empire. There's never been a Palestinian state until 40 years after Israel.
Right.
So that's the first geopolitical issue to deal with. People have asked, how should the war end? And there's those who say they should go into Rafah and just go through the tunnels and flood the tunnels or electrify them or whatever, and eliminate the remaining roughly estimated 15,000 Hamas fighters and be done with it. And I'm one who sort of thinks that's not a bad idea. But this week in the New York Times, Tom Friedman raises the issue of, okay, then what happens? Hamas was the elected government of Gaza. They exist because of popular support. The Palestinian Authority, which is run by a doddering guy in his mid-80s, Abbas, has no credibility here. And by the way, that should be a warning for America not to have a doddering 80-year-old leader at a time of crisis. So the idea that the Palestinian Authority can come in and take over ignores the fact that Fatah, which is the group in the West Bank, and Hamas hate each other. So people say, well, let's have a two-state solution. Well, you know who doesn't support a two-state solution? Hamas. It's written into their constitution that they believe in the river to the sea. It's all one big country. When you go over there and you talk to people, they go back in 1948, we tried to draw boundaries. We drew this boundary and that boundary, and the Balfour Declaration, the Brits drew this. The Arabs never agreed to any of it. They don't want any division whatsoever. So that is the real issue with creating a two-state solution. Linking Gaza with the West Bank is nearly impossible because you have to go through the middle of Israel to get there.
Right.
And I've been over there. If you go from Jerusalem to the airport and to Tel Aviv, you're on a highway that runs through the West Bank, and it is a highway with very high walls, with barbed wire on the other side of the walls, and there's very few exits to get on and off the highway to get you to Israel proper from West Jerusalem. Trying to connect a corridor to Gaza, which is on the other side of Tel Aviv, would be nearly impossible. Gaza was previously Egyptian. The Egyptians don't want it. The West Bank was previously Jordanian. The Jordanians don't want it. No Arab state wants to take any kind of refugees from Palestine. You know, even the United Arab Emirates, where 80% of the population are immigrants, mostly from South Asia, and many in the higher jobs from Britain and the US and Europe, they don't want them. So it's a real conundrum.
It's very complicated. It always has been very complicated. Just in what you've pointed out in this little podcast and the geographical aspects of it that most people in America probably don't understand as well as someone who's been there, it also brings back, to me at least, the need to have some independent eyes on the ground over there to kind of look at what's going on. It is complicated. I don't think we're going to solve it on this podcast, but at least we hopefully gave you a better picture of what's going on over there and why we care, right?
We do care because it's destabilizing the entire world. It destabilizes the oil supply. Hamas, as is the Houthis, as are the people in Lebanon, the Hezbollah, are proxies for Iran, and so they're getting involved in this. We just gave to the Ukrainians a shipment of Iranian arms bound for the Middle East that we intercepted, and now we're able to give that to Ukraine. So there's a lot of geopolitical forces going on here. A lot of people looking to the United States to see how strong are we going to stand by our ally, or can we be manipulated by a couple of mobs who show up and demonstrate in front of the White House or demonstrate in somebody's backyard. And that's a real test for President Biden. You know, people say his two-state solution, as I've said before, is, you know, Minnesota and Michigan. And he's in a very tough place because there's a lot of people in his party who have taken the Palestinian cause here, some of them with less thoughtfulness than others. Tom Friedman says the war should be prosecuted more like Munich and less like Dresden, meaning the Israelis should go out and assassinate these Hamas leaders instead of bombing them like we did in Dresden.
Well, again, complicated, but I think we have given you a concise picture of what's going on over there, and you can follow it from here. We'll report on it again. But I thought that because we had a kind of a slow political news week, which will not be the case next week, that we'd cover this. And so that leads us to next week. What do we got coming next week?
Well, we go to trial next week. So jury selection starts on Monday in New York for President Trump. He's not going to be happy about that. Friday, Speaker Johnson goes to Mar-a-Lago to kiss the ring and come away with some political cover from Donald Trump. Marjorie Taylor Greene is standing in the wings, talking to an audience of one with her issues. We now know that Joe Biden has paid $1.7 million of his legal fees with his campaign contributions. So that's now sort of gone over to both sides. We still have ongoing conflict in the Middle East, and we've got legal issues on Trump on the federal cases coming up. So stay tuned and buckle up. It's going to be a wild ride.
We're going to be here till at least the election. We'll see what happens at that point. Subscribe to the podcast on Spotify. That's the best place to get it. It's showing up on other platforms already, so you can get it other places. We will be back again next week with another edition of Red versus Blue.
Take care, everybody.